are back on the Zero Hour. With us now is Kenneth P. Vogel, who more popularly known around here as Ken Vogel of Politico, who tracks the confluence of money, politics, and influence for Politico, which is getting to be a larger and larger portion of our news cycle. With every passing week, it seems. Ken has an ebook out available at such fine virtual vendors as Kindle and Nook and all those guys. The book is called Big Money, $2.5 billion, one suspicious vehicle, and a pimp on the trail, and a pimp dash, I should say, on the trail of the ultra-rich who are hijacking American politics. Hey, Ken, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Hey, great to be with you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, well, thanks again. I must have been too easy on you last time or something.
We'll see if we can't correct that this time.
Listen, before we go any further, obviously people are going to want to know, and maybe you don't want to tip your hand. Okay, what's the suspicious vehicle and who's the pimp?
Sure. So the suspicious vehicle is actually my rental car that I drove to the hotel in Indian Wells, California, where the Koch brothers were having their annual big donor seminar, and they don't take too kindly to having reporters there, so they kicked me out, ushered me out to my car, and then reported the car as suspicious to the Riverside County Sheriff, who tracked me down later to figure out what this was all about. And I explained, I'm just a reporter, just trying to get information, and this is a challenge of getting information in this new big money political world where so much of the money is migrating to these secret, undisclosed vehicles where you don't know who the donors are, you don't know what their motivations are, and the only way you can really find out is by trying to sneak into their meetings, which is what I tried to do when my vehicle was reported as suspicious. It's actually also the sort of backstory behind the pimp, who was a former police officer who was doing security for the Democratic Governors Association when they had their big fundraisers around the Democratic Convention in 2012 in Charlotte, North Carolina. One in particular that he threw me out of was this fundraiser at the Duke Mansion. It's this mansion on the outskirts of Charlotte where they had a number of Democratic governors and a string quartet playing and tuxedoed waiters serving fancy hors d'oeuvres. And this guy explained to me, this is important for these people to be able to meet in private and not feel like their safety is at risk. And I'm saying, I'm not threatening their safety. I'm just trying to figure out who is giving this money. And so this is the challenge that we face and that all the media faces and voters face in this new world, is figuring out who's giving the money and why.
Well, nothing says we're here to do the people's work like a string quartet and waiters in tuxedos. It's interesting. So the guy who probably called in your car as a suspicious vehicle was the pimp, was the former pimp in question, which is interesting because my first thought when you said that they did that, they called in your vehicle like that, is that was a dick move. So
right.
It all fits together. It really was, by the way. I mean, that's an extraordinarily nasty and petty thing
and
to
even
do.
the sheriff who ended up tracking me down said, yeah, they reported the vehicle as suspicious. I had to come out there and take a report, and I got the report through the California Freedom of Information Act, and he said he thought it was weird, and that's the word he used, that they wanted to report this vehicle as suspicious when it was no longer on the premise and didn't seem to pose any threat to them. So the sheriff's characterization is weird. Your characterization is it's a dick move. I probably wouldn't quibble with either of them.
I would also add that, maybe the difference between you and me, I don't know, is I might have asked whether filing a false police report it was a charge that might stick in a case like this. But I guess you do have to report on these people. But it certainly is, it shows us who we're up against. And listen, as to the content of the book itself, it's a great topic because it's so important. You said that members of this mega donor, here's one of your interesting points that it doesn't really, I haven't heard other people bring up in quite this way, which I appreciate. You say that at a time when wealth is increasingly coalescing in the richest 1%, etc., members of this mega donor community, this is you, I believe, talking, it's certainly not me, and the consultants who spur them on are wresting control from the political parties which once combined to rule politics with an iron fist. Now, I know that ticks off Democrats, a lot of Democrats, when you say that. I completely agree that the biggest problem, particularly at the national level, has been a kind of duopoly of these two parties who can agree on social security policy or military policy or whatever, and really the people don't have any alternative. They have to accept it. So now you're saying they're wresting control away from the party structure. And here's the part where I might have phrased it more differently, but you say in a perverse way the new system is more democratic, but only for those with the cash to buy in. Now, I know what you're saying, Ken Vogel of Politico. I know you're saying I think you're saying because we don't have this lock, right?
Yeah, there are, in a weird way, there are more players, and it's less control. The party had really exerted control over sort of the parameters of the debate, like you said, on social spending, on military spending, on some of the big issues that our government grapples with. It was the parties who controlled it, and sometimes they controlled it in a sort of public way through their debates of their platform committees, and sometimes it was, closed door, smoky backroom deals where they gave a bridge to a member of Congress to vote for a particularly controversial bit of legislation, but you kind of knew that these they would characterize themselves as the adults were controlling things, and now you don't have that, and you have all these folks who have a ton of money, and they're able to really determine what the issues are that are talking about and the parameters of the debate. The move by Republicans to the right on fiscal issues, the Tea Party wave, that's in large part due to some of these very wealthy donors who funded these Tea Party groups, and the result is not necessarily what they wanted. The result is not that the fiscal policy of the country is sort of shifting to the right and becoming sort of more austere. The result is gridlock and chaos, like what we saw with the government shutdown, but you can't argue with the fact that it is having a real, very tangible result, and it's a result that affects regular people. The shutdown, deprives people of including women and low-income women and children of their social services, and it deprived federal government workers of paychecks, and you could trace that in a pretty direct way back to these very wealthy conservatives funding these Tea Party groups.
Now, it's interesting, and you name a lot of them. One of the names you don't bring up a lot, and I'm just curious to see if you counter them a lot. One of the names I don't see a lot is in your writing is Pete Peterson. And
right.
Now Peterson's been around for 30, 40 years, and he's been, because you make a great point about how these guys can change the debate. In a sense, no matter who wins a given election, they can change the subject a lot. And we're not talking about, certainly not about public financing of elections or, other topics. Job creation is off the map, but we're talking about what they want us to talk about. But the master of that, in my opinion, and I think the kind of proto donor for everybody you mentioned in a way, but you may disagree, is Peterson, who for 30 years has been funding these conferences to focus everybody's attention on the national deficit to the exclusion of all other issues. I mean, it's an issue to deal with, but kind of making it primary above everything else, and especially cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Now, whatever you think of his agenda, he's been spectacularly successful. And is that just coincidental? Was he just the first to think of it, or is there no relationship between Pete Peterson and the guys you cover?
Well, what's interesting is he has mostly stayed away from the direct election spending. He's been more on the issue advocacy side, and I think it's increasingly difficult in this new environment to be effective when you're just on the issue side. Even the Koch brothers, they're an example. They like to think of themselves as driven by issues, including those that Pete Peterson cares about. And they, for years and years, had spent their money supporting libertarian think tanks and some of these wonkier groups that if they did do public policy advocacy, did it in a way that was a little more green eye shades oriented and not getting into the electorum. When they became really impactful is when they started spending that money in some ways spending that money with the same motivation to shift the country to the right on fiscal policy. But they started doing it through elections and getting involved in elections with these big campaigns, grassroots and advertising campaigns to get people to cast their vote on the basis largely of these fiscal issues, but they made it clear they wanted people to go and make this an issue at the ballot box. And Pete Peterson has done that less. But you're right; he certainly could have been included as sort of an early forerunner of this new type of donor.
Well, that's and that's a very interesting distinction. Ken, I'm going to want to talk, if you're willing to hang around for a couple minutes of ads. I got more to ask you about Big Money, the book, and Big Money, the topic, but I will warn you, since I've been too easy on you in the past, if you use the word impactful again on the 0 hour, there will be consequences.
Noted.
All right. Listen, thanks. So Ken Vogel, a political reporter for Politico. Please stick with us. We will be right back after these messages. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the 0 Hour. And we are back on the 0 Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and with us still is Ken Vogel, political reporter for Politico, reporting on the intersection of big money and politics. His new book is Big Money, $2.5 billion, One Suspicious Vehicle and a Pimp. And Ken, there are a couple other great points in this book that I'd like to touch on. Maybe we can take them one by one. One is the chaos that these big donors create and their motivations, and then the way this has affected Democrats and consultants both. But let's take those topics one by one. You've made the point, which is also an important one, that these guys, at least on the Republican side, we've already seen they completely turned the primary system upside down. They kept Santorum, I think, and Gingrich for sure in, I guess, both those guys, and much longer than they would have stayed in otherwise. I guess number one question is, why would they do that? I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it from you. And two is, what are the implications for the future?
They did it because they think they know what works. They think they know politics, and that's sort of what motivates. I mean, obviously there's a passion element. They believe in these guys, but they also think that because they have been so successful in whatever their chosen fields are, in the case of the two examples that you mentioned, Sheldon Adelson is the guy who kept Newt Gingrich in the race for much longer than he otherwise would have been. Well, he made $40 billion on casinos, and in fact was really ahead of the curve, bucking conventional wisdom on Las Vegas. When Las Vegas was just a gambling town, he kind of decided, hey, I think there's a business here for conventions, and he plowed a lot of money into it. There were a lot of doubters. He was successful, and he made a ton of money. And then he went into Macau, the Chinese, the area of China where gambling is legal, and he spent a ton of money building casinos there, and people said, ooh, we're not sure if Macau is ready for these big, glitzy, Vegas-style casinos. He was right again. His bets paid off there, and so he thinks, hey, I'm the smartest guy here. Don't tell me that Newt Gingrich can't be elected president. I'm going to prove you wrong again. I'm going to spend my money to support a super PAC that supports him, and he's going to win the Republican nomination, and he's going to win the presidency. Clearly, folks who study politics knew that wasn't going to happen, and they tried to convince him, hey, you're wasting your money, and even more than that, you're hurting your ultimate goal. You're undercutting the possibility that Barack Obama, the guy who you've identified as the worst president ever, can be defeated. And his pouring money into Newt Gingrich dragged out the primary, like you said, ended up hurting Mitt Romney, headed into the general election against Barack Obama, and may have actually helped reelect Barack Obama. But Sheldon Adelson wasn't going to be convinced that somebody else knew better than he did, because he thought, I get politics. And, like I said in the beginning, passion is key. I get politics, and I believe in Newt Gingrich. And so that drove what otherwise would have, appear through an objective analysis at the time to be a really bad set of spending decisions. But that's the new world in which we live. If you got the checkbook, it doesn't matter what the odds say. It doesn't matter what the political professionals say. You can really affect the way elections go.
I think that's exactly right. In my career, I've had a chance to meet a few extremely wealthy and successful business people. I think you get it exactly right. in terms of how they think. I think these guys really think, hey, don't, I'm, to a certain extent, they may even, I'm not talking about Adelson specifically, but you might have a guy who, in a way, is kind of an idiot savant with certain money making. He has a gift, but he thinks that translates into every field of endeavor, and nobody's going to tell him otherwise. That seems to me to be a spot on analysis,
Yeah,
even
and
as Newt,
yeah,
even as Gingrich got stranger and stranger.
right. And the analogy that I draw is that it's not dissimilar from these guys who are super rich and super successful, whatever it is that they do, who happen to be sports junkies instead of political junkies, and they end up plunking down like a couple $100 million, or in the case of Steve Ballmer, who just bought the LA Clippers, $2 billion for a sports team, and they think, we'll see what Steve Ballmer does, but they think, hey, I made a ton of money at Microsoft or in hedge funds or whatever, and I think that same aptitude, that same skill set will apply to sports because I really like sports and I follow sports and I'm passionate about it. So I'm going to tell the GM, hey, you should pick this player. You should pick this quarterback. I'm going to tell the coach, hey, you might think about running this play. And the result is what we see here in Washington with the Redskins. Dan Snyder pretty much fits that bill, and the Redskins suck. And they just, it's like no matter what they do, no matter what big name players they buy, they're limited by this meddling from this owner who doesn't really have a clue, or certainly not as much of a clue as he thinks he does. And the result is often is backfiring.
Moneyball 2, the nightmare.
Right.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And the other piece of this, of course, and you mentioned this also, is that there are always consultants who see somebody with deep pockets and say, yeah, I'll play this guy's game. I'll tell him, yeah, this is what it would take for Newt to become the next president of the United States. But no matter how bizarre Newt gets, they're going to, I called him Dr. Strange, but that was just me. So these consultants are part of this new kind of mega donor ecosystem too, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right, RJ. They're not going to tell these mega donors no. And this new system, it's a cottage industry. And in order to be successful at it, you need to keep the checks coming to your group or your campaign or your candidate. And so when the mega donor tells you, and this is an actual example with Foster Freeze, who was the guy who kept Rick Santorum in the race, alongside Newt Gingrich, as the race sort of became more and more strange and less good for Republicans. He was giving money to the super PAC that was supporting Rick Santorum, and he said, I think we really need to do ads on Islamofascism and the threat of Islamic extremism. And this is like in New Hampshire, like the New Hampshire voters, they don't care about that. That's not they care. I mean, and to the extent that they do, it's far, far down their list of priorities behind jobs and behind health care and even Obamacare. But yet, the Rick Santorum Super PAC ads were talking about the threat of Islamofascism because nobody was willing, none of the consultants who were running this Super PAC, who were making money off this Super PAC, who were raising their profile off this Super PAC, were willing to tell Foster Freeze, maybe we should do ads about Obamacare instead.
Right. And Foster Freeze should have learned his lesson after Batman defeated him in that movie. But,
Right.
I'm not the first guy to make that comparison. I know. I'm sorry about that. But, and we've been talking about the Republicans the whole time, Ken Vogel of Politico, but we've also got the Democrats. You mentioned, being thrown out of a very classy party. You can now say I've been thrown out of better joints like this and say it truthfully. What about the Democrats and big money? They're shifting, they're moving, right? I mean, we got Hillary coming up, and she knows how to play the big money violin as well as anyone on earth, I think. But beyond that, the Democratic Party is shifting. And what are your thoughts on that?
That's exactly right, and that's where the potential for this big money to have the biggest impact is when there's no leader at the top of the party. There's no president who's running for re-election, or there's no nominee for president, and so the fight is both to determine which candidate is going to represent the party, but even more so, which direction the party is going to take. And so that's where you have the biggest difference. I mean, that's where you have the biggest differences in the Democratic or Republican base generally, but that's where you have the biggest potential for a single billionaire or a small group of multimillionaires to to get together and put a lot of money behind a candidate who may not be representative of what the party thinks of as its highest and best ideals, or frankly, of its most electable mainstream ideals, and get that candidate in the mix and potentially get that candidate the nomination. That's where you have the potential of a Democratic version of a Sheldon Adelson supporting a challenger to Hillary, who all the party leaders think is the best and most viable candidate in the general election. Well, all it would take is one billionaire with the willingness to write 7 or 8 figures behind Elizabeth Warren, or a more, just a more populist, progressive candidate. And you already see that there's the will there for that in the Democratic Party, that there's an audience there for a message that is to the left of Hillary's. Well, maybe a candidate could have emerged and caught fire among the Democratic progressive base on their own, but it certainly wouldn't hurt if they had a couple sugar daddies behind them. Then you could see the real challenge to Hillary take shape in a way that I think Democratic Party leaders would prefer it did not.
Yeah, although it may be that the base would be happy with that, we don't know, as you say. But do you see any possibility of characters out there who might fit that bill, who might step in and say, yeah, I'll write a Liz Warren or a Bernie Sanders, or, pick somebody else. I'll write a left Democrat big checks.
Yeah.
And
I do see that, and I see it, and it's on progressive. It's sort of on economic populism issues, raising the minimum wage, cracking down on the banks, the things that we think of Elizabeth Warren as sort of being diverging from Hillary and maybe some of the more centrist Democrats on. But it's also on environmental issues. Barack Obama was supposed to be the great champion. He was going to, lower the sea levels, or whatever his quote was when he was accepting the nomination. And, a lot of progressive Democrats for whom that is a top issue, even now that Obama is doing some executive action late in his, midway through his second term to, address carbon emissions and climate change. They're really dissatisfied. And Hillary Clinton has not been a superstar in the eyes of many of these environmental activist Democrats. And so you have folks like Tom Steyer, the retired San Francisco hedge fund billionaire, who's talking about spending $50 million of his own money supporting candidates who support cap and trade or other, what are regarded by Republicans and certainly potentially by some swing voters as really aggressive solutions to combat climate change. Well, if Tom Steyer is willing to do that in 2014 in the midterm elections, who's to say he wouldn't be willing to spend $100 million supporting a challenger to Hillary Clinton who's a little more aggressive on environmental issues? And that's where you have the potential for a real chaotic primary.
Well, that's very interesting stuff. And Ken, do you imagine that any of these left-leaning billionaires might want to invest in a progressive and populist-oriented radio show with a charming and charismatic host?
I mean, that actually has been something that in the past there has been some support for, as you know, among the Democratic millionaires and billionaires. But for whatever reason, they haven't continued to support, things like Air America in the way that they were talking about doing. And the money hasn't materialized, so there's this debate. And now, you'll add another thing to the sort of list, the buffet of options for them to spend their money on. They could give it to a super PAC and support an individual candidate in a way that they couldn't back during the Air America days. But you're right that affects the political debate, and perhaps it maybe even a more long-term way than a given super PAC in a given election.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, and thanks so much for coming on the show and talking about it with us. Kenneth Vogel of Politico. His new book is Big Money, $2.5 billion, One Suspicious Vehicle and a Pimp. He was on the trail of the ultra-rich who are hijacking American politics. Ken, as always, thanks for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure.
I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back after this with activist Ernie Powell about senior votes count. This is the Zero Hour.